Good evening and welcome to the Museum of the City of New York. My name is Lily Tuttle and I'm a curator here at the museum. Thank you all for joining us tonight at Behind the Scenes at the New York Times, a conversation with Maggie Haberman, Mark Lacey, and Sarah Maslin-Neer. We are honored that these very busy journalists took an hour out of the 24-hour news cycle to talk to us about their work and how they actually report and produce the daily miracle, as the Times insiders call the paper. Tonight's conversation is inspired by our current exhibition, Analog City, NYC B.C., or Before Computers, which I had the privilege of curating. Analog City explores how New York City grew and thrived and became a global metropolis in an era before computers. Through a look at several key industries, including newspapers and with the Times as a particular focus, the exhibition highlights some of the key systems and technologies that were central to New York's rise to become a command center for news, information, finance, and as E.B. White described it, the capital of the world by the middle of the 20th century. So we hope you'll return to the museum soon to check out Analog City, which is on the second floor, and to our other exhibitions like the just opened Food in New York, Bigger Than the Plate. And I also want to mention some fun Analog City-inspired programming that we have coming up later this fall, including a Twilight Zone-themed Halloween bash on October 28th with a mid-century retro horror theme. How can you say no? We also have 2 film screenings with great analog subjects. We're screening the recent acclaimed documentary, The Automat, on November 8th, and on December 15th, we screen The Apartment, Billy Wilder's classic 1960 Hollywood take on mid-century Manhattan life and out-of-office shenanigans. And there's a little clip of The Apartment in Analog City if you go upstairs after the exhibition. So please go to mcny.org/events for more information about these programs and more, and to, of course, register. Now, a few requests. You know what I'm going to say. Take this moment to silence any devices that beep, buzz, or make other noises. Remember, this meeting is about analog things, so no phones, no phones. Okay, and now I would like to briefly introduce tonight's speakers. White House correspondent Maggie Haberman joined the New York Times in 2015 and was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2018 for reporting on Donald Trump's advisors and their connections to Russia. She previously worked as a political reporter at Politico from 2010 to 2015, and before that at publications including the New York Post and the New York Daily News. Her new book, Confidence Man: The Making of Donald Trump and the Breaking of America, comes out next Tuesday. Mark Lacey is the New York Times managing editor. He is in his 2 decades at the Times. He's also served as assistant managing editor, national editor, weekend editor, deputy foreign editor, and a correspondent based in Washington, Nairobi, Mexico City, and Phoenix. Before coming to the Times, he worked at the Los Angeles Times, the Buffalo News, and the Washington Post. He participated in coverage of the Los Angeles riots in 1992 and the Northridge earthquake in 1994, both of which won Pulitzer Prizes for spot news reporting. And our moderator tonight is New York Times staff reporter Sarah Maslin-Neer. Neer was a finalist for the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for Unvarnished, her year-long plus investigation into the exploitive labor practices of New York City's nail salon industry. Before she became a staff reporter, Neer freelanced for 11 different sections of the paper, reporting from the Alaskan wilderness to the post-earthquake Haiti. Sarah is also the author of the best-selling book, Horse Crazy. We are thrilled to have Sarah back in the moderator's seat at the museum, where she has led many fascinating conversations over the years as part of the Only in New York program series. So now, won't you join me in welcoming Maggie, Mark, and Sarah to the stage?
Thank you, Lily. So I don't often get nervous doing these because we've done so many of them, and also because it's my job to talk to people. But I just want to put you in my shoes for a minute. This is like interviewing your own personal, like, Beyonce and Jay-Z. Like, it's unreasonable that I am here interviewing these master interviewers. So thank you for agreeing to come and talk to little me. Appreciate it. I want to address the elephant in the room, which is Maggie's tremendous book, which comes out October 4th, and it was leaked today. But Maggie will not be talking about the book. We'll do a little open-ended question and answer. You can ask about Trump. You can ask about analog stuff and digital stuff, but don't ask about the book. But buy the book, Confidence Man. So we were having a little bit of a pre-chat yesterday, and Mark, you told a really great story about Goodnight. So I'd love you to set the stage. Tell us about Goodnight.
So it's good to be here with everyone. I'm a managing editor of the Times, and in an earlier job, I worked over the weekends. I worked in the evening. I worked right up until the print deadline when we put the newspaper to bed, and there was this night staff, and everybody else has gone home, and the newspaper is being put to bed, and there is a person who is in charge, who runs the show, and nobody can leave until he says those words, "good night." That means that all the information has gotten from New York, from 620 8th Avenue, has been sent electronically to the printing plant, which is in Queens near LaGuardia Airport. It's off. It's there. The edition is closed. The final edition is closed. And when he says those words, "good night," all these people start putting on their coats and they head out into the evening. And that's the end of the print edition.
And anybody who's rolled over in bed and taken their phone off their nightstand knows the New York Times never says goodnight. Just such a quainter time when you could like put on your coat and news is done till tomorrow. So I love that story as setting the stage. So I'd love to ask my fellow panelists about your own personal trajectories coming up from really an analog world into the digital. So Maggie, can you start with your bio? Because you started very analog as a beat reporter at the Post, right?
The New York Post. And hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thank you for having me. Sarah, I don't think we can actually match that introduction that you gave of us, but we will try. So I started out as a copy kid, which is a clerk at the New York Post. I learned how to be a reporter at the New York Post when it was in the middle of a tabloid war with Daily News. And there were, at the time, I believe it was technically 4 editions of the New York Post at night. There was one that would go to bed around 8, one that would go to bed around 10:30, 11, and then one that was done at 1, but they would continue adding up until 2:30 with what were called replates. And I'm sure they still do that. That all changed, and I remember when it changed was when the internet was becoming a thing. We all had pagers in 1996. I got my first cell phone in 1998. And it was the size of my shoe, basically.
Anyone who knows Maggie cannot imagine her without a cell
Right.
phone. It's under her thigh. They're sending in text, probably from Donald Trump right now.
Nice. Thanks. I'll get my train of thought back in a second. 1998 was when the Bill Clinton sex scandal happened, and there was a website called The Drudge Report, and we had to check it all the time because it was this new website that was doing something we'd never heard of before. It was pulling news from, different organizations that had just developed websites and putting it there. And so there was a lot of checking for what was breaking on Drudge. And then there was another innovative website, which was the New York Times, which was producing content at a rate that nobody else was matching, and that was updating its stories. You would be able to answer this. I can't. My memory is it was updating Metro stories. That's what we were looking for at the New York Post and the Daily News. The Times would update at midnight, and we would look to see what they were posting for the next day and to see if we could match any of them. And a lot of time was spent between the hours of midnight and 1 a.m. matching New York Times stories. That was the feature of the job. And then we get into the 2000s, and there's the advent of blogs, and then you started filing several times a day, which we were already doing before on the web. And then And then Twitter came around in around 2008. I think that was the first campaign it existed in. And it was not in wide practice for a while, but by the early 2000s, early 2010s, sorry, it changed how we all did our jobs in the sense that a lot of news was coming through it. So that's been the evolution, and none of us have really slept since.
Maggie, if I could just follow up with one question. Can you talk about being a beat reporter and how your stories literally came to be? I mean, I imagine there were payphones involved and calling in copy, unthinkable stuff.
There were payphones. There was dictating stories by phone to a rewriter or to a dictationist. Again, this is all at the New York Post. There were initially stories that I was sent out on as a general assignment reporter. So funerals, fires, shootings, a lot of crime, which is what you did a lot of at the tabloids as a GA reporter. And then I went to City Hall in 1999, and Giuliani was in the middle of his second term, and there was an endless rolling controversy around Giuliani. Then and now, but it was a different nature then. And then it was very specific. On a beat, you are developing sources and you are interacting with, generally speaking, a set group of people every day. But then you try to find people, particularly at City Hall, who interact with the city government, whether that's lobbyists, whether that's city council members, who are on the other end of the hallway at City Hall, whether that is activists, advocates. It's a really, really rich beat. I was very fortunate to be on it.
And Mark, can you speak about your trajectory through this lens, and especially interesting about how to be a foreign correspondent, as you were in so many places, through an analog lens?
Let me tell you about the 1980s. So first of all, I have been on a panel with Maggie, a very memorable panel in which she was texting during the discussion, and she broke news from the panel, like it happened.
Sarah Sanders was leaving the White House. That was
Yeah,
the story.
yeah, that you remember that. So things could happen here. The phone is right there, so it's happened before. So I will take you back a little bit further because, first of all, I brought a typewriter with me to college. I was quite proud of the typewriter in the little case. I carted it off. And they have them up there. There's, I can recognize these. The stuff there doesn't look all that old to me. Let me tell you about being a foreign correspondent. So you went overseas. They had satellite phones at that time. These were incredible machines that were the size of large suitcases. And you basically had to set this monstrosity up and find a satellite. This is late 90s, and that could take an hour. And you then had access to a telephone in a place that did not have a telephone. So there's no way to use a cell phone in the places I was. So I've been in places where I am the only person in that area that can possibly communicate with the outside world. So it's very handy with rebel soldiers and others who sort of like you're able to give them a call back to headquarters or home or someplace. So that's one thing. I just remember the size of communication was 100 pounds or more. So that was, and I've actually met people, and this is in Africa, a New York Times former foreign correspondent who actually sent stories by carrier pigeon.
No, you've got
Yeah. Alan Cowell.
Oh my God.
Yeah, Alan Cowell, involved in a war in Congo, needed to get a story across enemy lines, and I don't know how it works. I'm not good with birds, but actually it was actually able to send copy over, type it out, and put it on a bird and send it out. So much has changed. Really, so much has changed. Yeah, I'll just stop there.
I'm actually just thinking of the classified ad for the reporter, must be good with birds back then. But you had a little bit of a sneaky reveal in our conversation about that midnight deadline that the Post was waiting for to match our stories. Can you reveal to this audience?
Well, so she was staying up until midnight. We were intentionally putting stories up to keep reporters like Maggie up late, and we didn't believe there would be enough people around for her to call anybody to confirm the story. So the New York Times at that point was not posting stories on its website by day. We would work on them all day for the newspaper, and we would wait until as late as possible, and then put them on the website. And we knew that there were journalists across the land who were waiting for that moment to do that. Earlier, I was at the Los Angeles Times earlier, and the New York Times was our competitor. So we did something that we thought was very sneaky. We sent a student to the printing plant of the New York Times, which is on 43rd Street in the building at the time. And this person stood outside the building and waited for the first edition to come off the plant. And then he walked to a payphone, and he dialed collect to the LA Times. And then I took the call. I know this is true. This person, it would be around 9 o'clock at night for the first edition. And so he would then read the front page to us. So this is before that thing called internet. So he would read the front page, and we would type it, and then we would try to match the New York Times. So matching the New York Times has been something that people have done for a long time.
It feels better not having to do that than having to do that.
And actually, that strategy of waiting till last minute is still employed by numerous entities, politicians. Often Friday late evening in the summer, they'll dump some news, and because they know we want to, take a break, and we don't, unfortunately. So we've talked a bit about what has changed. Can you talk about what you're surprised, Maggie, that hasn't changed in the course of your journalism?
That's an excellent question.
Maggie Haberman said it has to.
No, it is. It's a great question. I mean, just the fundamentals of reporting, the fundamentals of beat reporting, the fundamentals of how stories work. We get information. We are trying to write the most accurate first draft of history as possible. When we make mistakes, we correct them as soon as we can. I think that I know I keep coming back to the differences. One of the challenges on this job, and if I'm jumping ahead on something we were going to talk about, I apologize, but we'll sing a song or something. One of the challenges of the job now is that it is such a diffuse media environment. It's not just social media, it's niche websites, it's verticals that are focused on a specific topic. And the proliferation of journalism anywhere I consider to be a very good thing. However, not every website is the same as every other website, and not every website and not every news outlet is the same as the Washington Post or the New York Times or CBS News, and I could go down the list. And so readers, I think, are able to choose what news they want, but then they sort of expect it all to look the same.
Described it as a flattening of.
Yeah, it's so. One of the things about Twitter, and I think I said this on our call, but one of the things about Twitter that I remember complaining bitterly about to our now former colleague Alex Burns, who I worked with at Politico, and he actually just went back to Politico. But when he and I were covering the 2012 campaign, and Twitter was in pretty regular use at that point, I was very, very Twitter resistant and skeptical and thought it was poison, and some of that still holds. But at the time, my attitude was, I kept saying to him, everything looks the same. A 6-part investigative series that gets tweeted out looks exactly the same as a 4-inch page 6 item about, Lizzie Grubman. And it's impossible to, if I'm looking at the newspaper, I can tell by placement and scale and page count what the newspaper thinks of it and what it wants the readers to take, but you really can't from Twitter. And I think that has been problematic in terms of readers and readers understanding what we're doing and what we're trying to do and what we're saying. And I think it has just had a reductionist effect on everything.
Mark, I want to talk to you about running the non-analog newsroom because now you're the manager of the New York Times, and I'm sitting next to you, and I imagine you weren't running it back then. You were a cog in the machine. But I mean, talk to me about live blogs and 24-hour coverage and running that beast.
So when that Supreme Court draft opinion overturning Roe v. Wade leaked sometime back, it was the evening, and it was utterly fascinating because Adam Liptak was in D.C. He led our coverage in Washington. That's what would have always happened. The reporter in Washington would write that. The editors who drove that coverage all night long until morning were on the 12th floor of a office building in Seoul. They're our overnight news team. So they then handed off to London, where we have a newsroom of over 100 people, and then New York wakes up and takes over in the morning. And that's not to say the Washington Bureau is toiling, but we are now round the clock. There is never a moment. There's no good night. There's no point in which the lights are off, because we have basically 3 newsrooms situated in time zones around the world, and no matter what time something happens, there are journalists to get it up immediately. And I wake up in the middle of the night sometimes and pick up my phone. This is a habit that annoys my wife to no end and that I have to get over, but I do it. And it is amazing the journalistic energy that is happening at any time of the day or night. So the hurricane, we had people in Cuba, in Florida, who are covering that hurricane at 3 o'clock in the morning when I happened. So it really is never stopping. It's pretty remarkable.
And being at the COG level, it's also fascinating. So when we do these live blogs, which now we've transitioned really to, with a Liptak story like that, you'll also have a live blog, which is gathering reaction from around the country, addendums, news analysis. And there'll be a team of us, especially now remotely during COVID, a team of us will be sitting on a group chat, essentially, Audible. So it feels like you're in the newsroom, and people will just be calling out, and they're all over the world. Who can handle that? Who can get the photo of, we have a news analysis coming, and we have a justice who has said something in the news. It's maybe 20 or 30 people, and we produce news on a continuous basis, sometimes at every 5 minutes, which is a total departure from Good Night.
Yeah, we basically our goal is something big happens in the city, in the country, in the world, and we want you to not turn on your TV set. Don't go to CNN. We want you to go to the New York Times, and we want you to go because you're going to see that there are a team of journalists who are on it as it's happening, and we're calling it real-time journalism, live journalism, and it's going to be unfolding. As we learn something, we're going to be sharing it in real time. We're still going to confirm it. We're still going to be careful. We're not putting up rumor and innuendo, but as soon as we confirm it, we're going to publish it, and we're not waiting until midnight so the competition can't get it. Maggie contributes to this all the time, and many of her scoops are published soon after she confirms them on the New York Times. Minutes later, they're published.
It's we do have this this running form of journalism at this point, and it is not just around big events, but sort of bigger ongoing events, right? Like the midterm elections, and there is a desire to, I think, showcase the reporting and also to show people that we are giving them a broader and deeper news experience than they have had at other times. I actually think that one of the moments when we really transitioned, we were definitely doing it in 2016, because I remember during that campaign was when we really started doing live chats during debates, for instance, or major events. But I remember the first time, at least that I can recall, us doing it in the DC Bureau, which is where I was for the last 4 years. I'm actually not in the DC Bureau anymore. I'm a political reporter now. But it was when Michael Cohen testified before the House Oversight Committee, and we did a live chat, and I think that the audience was pretty riveted by it, because it wasn't just, and here's what Michael Cohen just said, because to Mark's point, you could turn on your television for that, but we're trying to explain this is why it's significant. This is, either different or the same of what he said before. This is what the implications are for Trump, and so we're hoping to give people a richer experience.
I want to switch tack slightly to talk about covering the White House in the analog versus now. I'll start with you, Mark, because you witnessed something pretty interesting. You covered a pivotal moment in Bill Clinton's campaign.
Yeah, so I covered the Clinton White House, and Bill Clinton was the first president to host a live internet chat, and I was there, and it was this, the AOL line that that makes that squawking sound, and it was very shaky. It was very shaky. He's typing. He's speaking. What we learned from that was the whole thing was kind of manufactured. They had the questions were pre-approved, and he was writing. He was just sort of playing with the technology. We learned that from that story that Bill Clinton did not have a computer or use a computer. So he just had paper and pens on his desk, and he just wrote notes, and other people turned them into files and other things. He did not communicate that way. Just imagine what Kenneth Starr would have done if there was like email, texting. There was none of that. That was not part of the investigation. So we had a president who was really part of an earlier generation in how you communicated, and then a lot changed by the time Maggie started covering a more recent president.
It's funny, though, I was thinking as you were talking, Mark, that so the interregnum was Obama and Bush, but I know the Obama presidency better. And Obama, liked devices. He liked an iPad. He liked having a phone that I think he found a little frustrating because there were things he couldn't do with it because they made it a secure phone. But Obama was very much a product of the newer generation. Trump is actually, he's an entirely different entity, doesn't use text, doesn't use email, and yet is Twitter obsessed and obsessed with what he can find online, but hates taking notes himself and hates when people take notes around him unless he tells them to, which is, a whole other thing. But everyone around him obviously came up in the tech era. And so at the White House, there were a bunch of aides who had personal phones and a White House phone. And what we've seen, this is less direct to the president himself, but what we've seen with this investigation into January 6th and the House Select Committee that's looking at what happened, there's this cache of texts that Mark Meadows turned over to the House Select Committee. And they have basically been the narration and the roadmap for the committee about, what to research and who was involved. And it's unimaginable, to your point, to think about. I mean, look, there obviously was Linda Tripp and her recordings during the Bill Clinton impeachment, or at least during the investigation. This has just been a whole different order of magnitude and volume.
I want to talk about, Maggie, misinformation in the age of analog versus digital, because I didn't grow up in such an analog age. I mean, I guess I had a cassette player. Maybe my big brother did, yeah, I was born in the '80s. But it seems to me the wildfireness, is that a word? Can I make it one? Of misinformation is a product uniquely of the digital age, though I may be incorrect, because it can spread so dramatically, and that makes our jobs hard.
If you research the history of newspapers in this country, and particularly in this city, going back to the early part of the 20th century, a lot of misinformation. And so there are a lot of, especially when there were multiple editions a day of various newspapers, there were all kinds of things that made print that are a little hair-raising. But to your point, it's the speed and the volume. And so that is what has changed, because you can't contain it the same way. People who are facing misinformation can't combat it the same way. I was reflecting today to my husband, who's also a newspaper person. Well, actually now he's at NBC Digital, because we all work for some form of online at this point. But we met at the New York Post, and we were talking about outrage, which is at least part of a related fuel of misinformation. And we had an editor at the New York Post who had passed away a long time ago, but I remember her battling bitterly with the Metro editor about a specific story that she thought was irresponsible. And her saying to the editor, as she got up from her chair to, I think, go to the smoking room, which wouldn't exist now, saying there is nothing more irresponsible a newspaper can do than manufacture outrage. But now, and it was dead on, but there's all kinds of people manufacturing outrage right now. And so I think that is a big piece of what drives misinformation. But it wouldn't spread the way it does online without the ability for not just the speed of it, but the fact that a site like Twitter, as I said, everything looks the same. It becomes very hard for people to tell the difference between what's a credible source and what's not.
And Mark, we've launched a lot of new and interesting ways to combat misinformation. I've been seeing these little bugs in the stories that say, this comes from this. Can you talk about the ways we're fighting this?
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and it's out there. All sorts of misinformation is just surging through the internet. People can't necessarily tell, where it came from, whether it's true. So it's just all a jumble. So what we're trying to do is, instead of just ignoring this stuff that is out there, sort of taking it on and tackling it and telling people what the truth is. And so it's just like a different strategy of, one reason we do this is we want people, when they're searching on Google for, can bleach help me with, with a particular malady, or like, we want them to come to something, to find something responsible. And we don't want them to go off and find, and to be led astray. So the New York Times can write about that and tell you something that isn't true. And so I think fact checking, finding ways of putting the truth out there on things that you're kind of shocked anybody would even be considering is a part of our strategy.
Fascinating. I think maybe I'll open it up to questions now. Like I could ask them a million more, but that's not fair. There was a really good question. I had it on a piece of paper that I left in the green room. It sounds like it's a fake question that we made up, but it actually is real. But I'm going to ask it first of Maggie, but it's an audience question. I lost the paper, Fran, though. Do you have the paper? No? It's in the green room. I know what it says, but it sounds like a plant. It's not a plant, which is, can you talk to us about access journalism, which is a criticism journalists get all the time? Okay, but here's where it sounds like a plant. Because isn't access important to do good journalism? Such a friendly question.
Sarah thought this was not a real question when we were reading the
Too
question.
nice.
So access journalism is now a phrase that gets thrown around constantly, especially on Twitter, and it's actually not an expression I had ever heard until the last couple of years. And what I think that people, I mean, I guess I can't talk to you about it in the sense of explaining it because it's not a thing. What people seem to think that they mean is they seem to be indicating there's some kind of a transaction going on. So that if you're talking to someone for a story, you're guaranteeing they're going to get quote unquote good coverage. And we all interact with sources. We all interact with people we cover. We interact with our subjects. That's, again, the implication is that we're all not covering certain things in order to maintain that. And the cry gets said a lot, especially around Trump coverage. It's been alleged about us. It's been alleged about the Washington Post and about Bloomberg. And it's, if you look at the coverage of Donald Trump, I'm not really sure what people think is being hidden, because it's rigorous, and I think I would argue it's quite fair. But it is, I don't think these are stories generally that he's seeking. So now Donald Trump is a specific figure on this, and I think this is where it gets disorienting for people because he feeds off positive and negative attention in a way that there's no other politician that I've ever covered does. And he's not, I mean, he didn't spend his life in politics, but he did spend his life in media. And so I think it has had a sort of disorienting effect, but it's a term that gets used a lot, and it's a misnomer. It's not a thing in journalism. We have to interact with people. We have to deal with people we are covering. We have to be fair. We have to be accurate. We have to be tough, and we do all of those things, but we do all of those things while engaging with people we cover very often. Do you disagree with anything I just said?
No.
Boss?
No, it's true. It's true. That critique has been around. That critique is not a new critique. It's been around forever. Ben Bradley was viewed as chummy with JFK, and if you go to I was in Washington, and you'd walk into a social gathering, and there are politicians there are journalists there, there's sort of a mixing of hanging out and doing business that exists in Washington. But any journalist who is a true journalist, it knows good information, acts on good information, and sources know that if a good journalist learns information, they're going to publish said information. It's just the way it works.
I have a mildly inappropriate access journalism anecdote. I've been debating whether or not I should say it, but I'm going to say it. So I went on a date, and someone accused me of being an access. Oh, you journalists have just do access journalism, and I basically gave the answer that Maggie gave, and he kept going on about it. And at the end, I said, "Well, sometimes, I do. You're right. I do sometimes like provide access or cut off access. Sometimes I just cut it off." And he said, "Really?" And I said, "Yes, right now." And I left.
That's not inappropriate at all. That's a great story.
It was so awesome. It was like my awesomest move. So are there any questions from the audience? Yes. Oh, hold on. Just running with it.
Oh, thank you. Hi. When I first saw the title for this program, it said The Daily Miracle. I actually thought it was about the Daily podcast and how you put that together. I quickly realized it wasn't, but I guess my question is, if you could talk about the Daily a little bit and how podcasting sort of informs everything that we're talking about, how that brings viewers in, how that informs viewers. I mean, obviously it's free, but I'm sure from a business perspective, there's also a reason why you're doing it. So I'd love to hear your perspective on the Daily, which is amazing, by the way.
I feel very chagrined that we didn't bring up podcast once. Thank you. You're great.
True. We should add a chair and text Barbaro and see if he'll join us here.
The true Jay-Z. Yeah,
Yeah,
should've been here.
right. So Michael Barbaro and the entire Daily team are sort of rock stars, and the Daily has not been around all that long, and yet it is something that people are so devoted to listen to every morning on college campuses. It's particularly remarkable. I go to college campuses, and do you know Michael Barbaro is the number one question. I have come across people who can imitate him. They're so good they could actually fill in for him if he was. It's pretty remarkable. But so the Daily, what's pretty remarkable about the Daily, although everything I just said about how wonderful it is true, Daily couldn't exist without the rest of the New York Times, without the New York Times newsroom. The New York Times newsroom is what provides the Daily with that expertise. And so it's actually a perfect way to introduce people to New York Times journalism, the rigor of it, how brilliant our journalists are in how much they know about the topics they're covering. And people come into the Daily, we see a spike in readership of the story that people are talking about that day. So people are listening to the Daily and then seeking out the story. It's definitely helping. The Daily has become a juggernaut, but it's very much helping the entire New York Times and introducing people to the New York Times.
It's also, I do think there is something different just about audio journalism. I think that there is especially people who are driving to work, people who are commuting, people who are walking to work. I mean, what I hear more from anybody is, I listen to Michael Barbaro, and for those of us who have known Michael for a very long time, this transition to pop star has been both exciting to watch for him, but it's very interesting how people engage with him. I mean, they really feel bonded to him in sort of a very specific way that's different than what you would experience, I think, with written journalism. But the number of people I hear from when I'm on the Daily versus reading my stories, it's night and day. And the number of people who prefer having the important points of a story related to them, and I would give you an example, was in recent episode. I did 2 recent episodes related to the Trump documents case, and it's a confusing story. It's got a million different twists and turns. It's dense. It's legally complicated, and the Daily really helps break it down. And I think that there are a number of stories where we have been able to present something more human and interactive that way.
I have another little anecdote. So this is called Behind the Scenes at the New York Times. So behind the scenes, originally the Daily was going to be a 2-person show, and I was going to be the co-host, but I failed the audition. That is a true story.
I'm going to come to this event every time you do one, because this is how I'm going to learn what's happening.
Oh,
This is great.
I'm learning new things here.
This is good.
Great.
Everybody thought I made it up, and then I went to the 92nd Street Y to see Barbara speak, and I went to the green room to say hi, and I was with my boyfriend, and he said, she keeps saying this thing, and he always thought it was a lie, and then I come in, and Barbara goes, "Oh, Sarah, you were supposed to be the co-host." Anyway, first in the white shirt, and then can you raise your hand with it? Yep, and then in the middle there.
One of the analog features of a newspaper was the newsroom. And there is a newspaper in New York that is trying to function without a newsroom. And I'm wondering if you think that that is possible, or if that's the death knell of one paper, or if that speaks to the future of newspapers.
We have to be nice because one of the top editors of that paper is in this room. So we'll pull some punches. No, we'll be
Hi, Chris.
straight.
Chris is a former newspaper guy. I think Mark can probably speak to this better than the rest of us, but I would actually argue that most newsrooms are functioning without a newsroom right now because nothing is really back entirely since COVID. Everything is still a little different, but and just speaking for myself as somebody who worked in that newsroom once upon a time, it's devastating to not have a newsroom. Newsrooms are vital. They are hubs, not just for collegiality and camaraderie, which doesn't always exist in a newsroom, but at least for just interacting with people. But it's how ideas happen. Is you walk over to somebody's desk and you talk to them. I mean, you know this as well as anybody. I don't actually think it's the future of all journalism, but I do think the more that you see newspapers going under, which we're seeing all over the country, and you're seeing hedge funds buying newspapers and trying to turn them to digital machines, that is what's going to happen, and it's bad.
Can I take a stab at answering that? I owe my whole career to the physical newsroom. So I started as an intern at the Times, but it wasn't the fancy internship where you get paid. Actually, it was a thing we called the local, hyperlocal blog. And they said to me, it was covering Greenpoint. And they said, you don't have to come into the newsroom. I said, look, guys, you're not paying me. The way you're going to pay me is with a key card to that building. Like, come on. So it's 2008, and we had a huge number of layoffs at that time. It was a really frightening time to be entering the news business, but it meant there were a lot of free desks. So I sat down at a desk and did all my work from a desk. And when you heard Lily say I freelanced for 11 sections, that's because after work was over, I would walk to every desk and ask, what can I do for you? Or how about this idea? And I only got access to those 11 sections because one was on the northwest side of 4 and the other one was up at 3. And there's Dame Gregory Winter, the foreign editor, who sent me to Haiti as a plucky intern. And I even, when I finally, I ended up getting a nightlife column that was really just a thing on the side for them. But finally they gave me a maternity cover. And I said to them, I love the job, but I'll have one condition for my 6 months. And they're like, you can't have conditions. This is the New York Times. I was like, okay, but I have a condition. And it was that I would get a nameplate for my desk, like everyone else had, a metal nameplate. And they gave me a metal nameplate, and I stuck it up there. And everyone thought I worked there, and now I do. But I think newsrooms are really vital, if maybe not for us who have established ourselves and some to a lesser degree, but for people who are finding their way, it is absolutely vital. And I shudder to think what we've lost for the fellows we have coming through, the next generation, and I hope we all get our butts back at our desks. You had a question, and then let's take 2 more, and then one in the back. No, it's in the middle, and then you. Mom.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on the evolution of local news over the past 2 decades.
In New York or in general?
It can be in general, but New York is also good.
You should take this.
Well, I'll talk about local news across the country. I mean, local news has been devastated, and you will not find anybody within the New York Times who is celebrating this. We think it is awful, dreadful. First of all, we came up through local news. They sort of stress the more glamorous aspects of my journalistic past in the introduction, but first time walked into the Trumansburg Free Press and just said, I'm here, do you need help? That was a free internship while I was in college. The Buffalo News for a year and a half, I was the Tonawanda bureau chief. Yes, you're meeting the Tonawanda bureau chief. Local news is sort of what got me into this business. Wouldn't be here without local news. And local news, you've seen the stories, you've seen the statistics. It's being decimated. the business model isn't working. I travel a lot around the country. You pick up the papers that do exist, and they have nothing in them. You do a little bit of research, and there is sometimes a single soul who is the journalist there. It's awful. It's dreadful, and it has, profound effects on our democracy, on our what we know about our communities. It's devastating. There are efforts to try to come up with a different business model, and there are some successful ones, but they're closing faster than the new ideas are coming up, and it's I would say, national crisis level. It's awful.
There's a lot of focus on death of democracy, and what journalism's role is. And I would just make the point that the lens tends to be, almost exclusively on the national level, and that's wrong. There is no one watching local dysfunction, local corruption. Look at what's happening in Mississippi with this scandal around Brett Favre. That was whose name I'm positive I'm mispronouncing, and I apologize. But that was local journalists, and everyone else has started picking it up. But when people are not, our role as journalists is to hold power to account, whoever those in power are. And at the local level, there tends to be people who are taking advantage of others because they assume fewer people are watching, or because that's the way the system is set up. And it's just devastating, and you can see the impacts. And then there is also the real devastation of people who lose their jobs in these industries, and reporters are not doing their jobs. Nobody goes into this business to get wealthy, but they're also not doing it to work for free. And they're doing it. It is still a job, and it's terrible.
A small counterpoint to that is something that you'll see in the exhibit is that a lot of the proliferation of newspapers in the early days of the city was to cater to immigrants, and so it was in many different languages. And there is a fairly robust foreign language press in New York specifically. A lot of people still get their news, their first place is a newspaper. So that's in Korean, in Chinese, in Tagalog, in Spanish. And that's fairly robust. And actually, my nail salon investigation that was cited earlier, part of my reporting relied on their very granular reporting, because there's 2 or 3 Korean language papers. So they want to be the one to get the scoop when the manicurist was defrauded by her boss for $5,000. They're hunting it. I had a stringer who assisted me, who every day would just type in the word Kim in Pacer, which is the court database, just looking for things that happen to Koreans. And that's a healthy press landscape. Competition is what makes good journalism. And so it's very dangerous that us and the Washington Post are kind of the only big dogs left. You want those people fighting for every scrap of story, because that's how truth gets uncovered. But the foreign language press is still doing it to a degree, in New York City at least. I think we had my mom in the back and then this one in the middle, and that'll be it.
Okay, you've revealed my identity. I really wanted to just address the issue of outrage. I'm a psychologist. Outrage is a state of excitation, and the truth isn't. And I wonder, what can we do to combat outrage when it is so exciting and the truth is just the truth?
Did you have to call on your mother? I don't know how to answer that question.
She's real good.
That's a really good question. If I had an answer, I think we would all expend a lot less energy on various days. I think that unfortunately, this is the problem with the internet. It is the problem with, broadly, and it's the problem with social media specifically, that it is, the algorithms are all designed to push the outrage buttons. So I think that we all do what Mark was talking about, which is we try to explain what truth is on various topics, and we try to contextualize it. One thing that I think is vital is not sounding as if we're finger wagging. but just making very clear what facts are. But it is, it's one brick at a time, and it's the impact of social media on everybody's to your exceptionally put point about a state of agitation. I don't know how anybody starts taking the temperature down unless people really gonna go, hands-free off the keyboard on a lot of this stuff. And I think a bunch of people aren't ready to do that yet.
I actually had I would differ with you, Mom, about this because I think the truth is powerful. I had an example today. I received the most vitriolic, downright nasty email from a horse activist, and I love horses. And I wrote a story about carriage horses, really a top-down look at the industry that was objective. It just was. And they were infuriated that I didn't vilify the carriage owners. And I responded with civility, with fact. And I got an email to Felice, my editor, and I today. I'm better than the email I sent. The internet induced me to write this rageful email. Thank you both for responding with humanity and fact. And I have always responded to outrage with, I'm a real person, you may not speak to me that way. And everybody tells me I'm crazy for responding to all those emails. I have almost 100% apology rate and quite a good percentage of opening a dialogue to try to get to a greater understanding. So I do think truth can combat that vitriol, at least when it comes to crazy horse ladies. So the next question was in the middle, and then I think that'll close us out. And I hope you'll join us for a lovely wine reception upstairs after.
Hello. As you can see, I'm part of the digital generation taking notes on my phone, but I actually work at a print magazine that was founded by young adults and only young adults writing for it. And it's only published on paper, so you can't read the articles on the internet. So my question is, how can journalism in text or written form compete with the fast-paced videos and all the social media posts today?
Mark?
Thank you. Thank you. We all remember when the Kindle came along, and books were going to be gone. Nobody would ever pick up a book. It's not efficient anymore. And I do believe that I love the fact that you work for such a publication. I'm going to seek it out and read it. I think we all should. There's something wonderful about that, not trying to compete online, not even going there, and relying on people to pick up your publication and just read it in a different way. So there's something wonderful about it. Whether that is always, for me, in where we are right now, going to be sort of niche, but there's no problem with that. The way the New York Times is viewing things is we want to be read all around the world, all around the country, all over the city. And so we need ways to reach all of those people. And we have, for some people, the print newspaper that some of you know and love. And we have applause in the front. I appreciate that. So for some people, that's it. For many more people, it's your phone. And we're providing our journalism in a number of different ways, and people get to pick and choose based on what works for them. Wordle, though, only works online. We don't have a print Wordle yet, so that's a problem.
And I think that's a really uplifting thought to end on. You know, this conversation was never intended to be analog bad, old funny days, digital better. And I think what Mark just said is that we hybridize both and we take the value from all different mechanisms, because the real important part is telling the story and getting out the truth. Thank you so much to my panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.